Greetings and welcome to the Cerebral Women Art Talks podcast. I'm Phyllis Hollis, your host. As an extension of my Instagram page, Cerebral Women, this podcast offers insights into the visual art world. I interview artists, mainly artists of color and female artists who will freely articulate what inspires their creativity. In addition, you'll hear interesting perspectives from dedicated art professionals who work with artists and the art institutions that feature them. I'm confident that collectively, these individuals will indeed stimulate your mind as they do our eyes. Please know these interviews are conducted in my Manhattan apartment, so please forgive the background sounds of city life. Welcome to the Cerebral Women Art Talks podcast. This episode features María Elena Ortiz. She is a curator at the Modern Art Museum of Fort Worth, where she, in 2023, curated Jammie Holmes' Make the Revolution Irresistible, and in 2024, Surrealism and Us, Caribbean and African Diasporic Artists Since 1940. She was previously curator at the Pérez Art Museum Miami, where she curated group shows, Allied with Power, African and African Diaspora Art from the Jorge M. Pérez Collection, and The Other Side of Now, Foresight in Caribbean Art. Her solo exhibitions include with artists Firelei Báez, Ulla von Brandenburg, William Cordova, Teresita Fernández, José Carlos Martinat, Carlos Motta, and Beatriz Santiago Muñoz. At the Pérez Art Museum in Miami, she founded the Caribbean Cultural Institute, a curatorial platform dedicated to Caribbean art, and worked to grow the museum's collection, securing works by Simone Leigh, Bisa Butler, Bony Ramirez, and others. Welcome to the Cerebral Women Art Talks podcast, and enjoy this episode featuring María Elena Ortiz. María, welcome to my podcast. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
When did you recognize your interest in visual arts?
I recognized my interest in visual arts at a very early age. I was born and raised in Puerto Rico, and of course, people know a lot about Puerto Rico through its culture, through its music, through reggaeton and so on. So those types of practices were always around me growing up, dancing. Now, my parents, they were, working class individuals professionals, and they would not collect art, but they would have like reproductions or prints. So we had at our house in Puerto Rico a print of a really famous painting by Francisco Yer, which is like a fantastic painter from Puerto Rico of modern, impressionist type of work. And by that, I mean like late 19th century. And his masterpiece, which is El Velorio, my parents had like a reprint of that in our house. Also, they had like reprints of Salvador Dali's Portrait to Abraham Lincoln. And they also had, I still remember like some sheets in their bedroom that were, I guess, inspired by Mondrian. So there were always little hints of kind of the fine arts in my house. And my father, who was really interested in philosophy and in popular music, the Beatles, for example. So he was also like a really he would share a lot about culture and politics. So I think that from a very, just that exposure at home, even though it wasn't like my parents did not talk about those works in a deep way, the way I do it in terms of analyzing them, they just liked them, I think. And they also liked having stuff on their walls that they could afford, and that it would probably just beautify the space. So
And so when did you decide to study art?
So I really wanted to go into art, not art making, because I just never thought I would make things like that, even though I took my mom put me and my younger sister in the Liga de Arte de Puerto Rico de San Juan, which is like a place where you can go take classes as a child and adult. We did like painting there and drawing as a Saturday kind of hobby. But I never thought that I would kind of be a visual artist, but I always wanted to talk about art, study art as cultural artifacts. But growing up in Puerto Rico, my parents were like, no, like, you should be an attorney. You're not going to be able to make a living out of that. And I think that in the context of Puerto Rico, and even I think here in the US, also when you come from specific backgrounds, I'm a Black Latina, and a lot of those realms are museums are more of like the kind of wealthy or art collection wealthy classes. It's certainly not the routes that we know about in terms of how to have a lifestyle that you want to have in terms of just living well, right? So they were like, no, you should just be a lawyer. And but I always liked hanging out with artists and talking about art. So I ended up majoring in anthropology because I thought it was like something that is close to art, but then also close to science. So they would like understand that. And I started in Boston. At the moment when I was in college, my mom moved to Texas. So I ended up finishing college in Texas, and there it was a professor of mine that because I did anthropology and then also art history classes, so I had a minor in art history, and it was one of my history professors that told me, you should go into curating. I think you'll be great at that, and if you apply to this fellowship that was at a local museum, I will support you. I was in Houston at the time. And I didn't know what a curator was per se, but I thought, oh, I'm curious about this. And this guy thinks that I could do this. So let me explore. And I should also say that before that moment, so I started college in Boston and then I went back to Puerto Rico for like a semester and I took some classes there. And at that time, one of my dearest, kind of longest friends, who's also a curator, her name is Marina Reyes Franco. We went. She's the curator of the Contemporary Art Museum in Puerto Rico, and we've been friends since fifth grade. She when I went back to Puerto Rico, we were kind of she was at the school there, and we started hanging out with a group of artists. And I think that also it was like a nice kind of segue into what became a career that we were very young, like in our 20s. And then we start kind of meeting some of the most interesting contemporary artists in the island at the time. And then I moved to Houston and we both kind of continue our historical interest. So there was also a little bit of that, of the social aspect of what the art world brings.
Do you recall what artist, or if there was an artist from that period in your life that really just inspired you?
Definitely. And some of them are still creating inspiring work today. So, for example, at the time, we started hanging out with a group of artists that were related to an initiative that was developed by a curator and cultural producer in the island called Michi Marswatch. And the project was Proyectos M, and they were doing a lot of social practice work. So there was an artist named Jose Negron who in Puerto Rico, drug addiction is a big deal. Like there's a lot of drug addiction, especially heroin, opioids. And you see these drug addicts from a really young age. Like I remember seeing a person shoot up heroin just as I was driving from my house to my grandparents' house. In the middle of the day, you just watch them. Like it's just, you just grow up and you see them through your life. So for example, at the light that was going into the street that led to my neighborhood, there was a guy that my dad called El Ejecutivo, the executive, who he would ask for money for his drug addiction in a suit. And that's why my dad called him the executive. But we saw his life from when he would relapse, when he was again, when he had a girlfriend, Anyway, so they're very present on the everyday life. And what Bubu did in this project, Vela Parking Services, which eventually was shown at the Torino Triennial in 2005, was that he created an agency for them to kind of give them visibility. And to me, that was very impactful because if you go to the Old San Juan, I think even till this day, you might be one of those people may come in and ask you to wash your car. And that's a way for them to get money. And if you don't give them money, then they might break your window or they might do something to your car. So he just created uniforms for them and like Vela, like I watch after your car, and to give them a more visible role that people could engage with that community in a more equitable way, if that's useful to describe, because it's like they're there, but people like kind of try to not engage. So that to me was very impactful, because it's making that visibility and making that community visible. Then we can have a conversation of what is this aspect of Puerto Rican life? Like, what does it say? Like, how can we talk about it? How can we address it? So that was a really neat project. And those were the type of projects they were doing, that the generation of artists were doing at that time. Along with another one, Chemi Osejo, who's still creating works inspired by social practice, that he did a project in a town in Puerto Rico that was creating a museum for one of the impoverished areas of the town. To me, that was just ways in which we can, because Puerto Rico is a complex space, it's still a U.S. colony. Like, so how can we, and it's a very aggressive and violent place to live in terms of, the drug violence and just the precariousness of living there, as you probably saw when Hurricane Maria happened, which that became more obvious. So this project allowed me to see my world in a different way, and in a way that I can speak about it.
So on the topic of Puerto Rico, your culture, your background, I'm really curious about if you feel Latinx or Hispanic art can be defined.
Well, I think that we need to kind of break that down a little bit, because I think that those terminologies are also very generational. And there's a generation of people that fought for the term Hispanic that might feel that the term Latinx is disregarding that. So I do want to honor that a lot of those terms point to different moments of what it means to be of Latin origin in the US and negotiating that. A lot of us have connections to the Spanish crown, like in the case of Puerto Rico. Others have connections to the French, the Dutch, think about Haiti, or even Portugal in the sense of Brazil. So Latinx allows, I believe, for a more encompassing description of all these different cultures and alliances and solidarities that people that have connections to kind of that colonial enterprise, which is now, of course, with the United States being such a strong power, is being negotiated through kind of the US experience. Do I think that it could be solely defined? No, I think that all these terms, and even the term kind of Black, similar, to African American, etc. Those are terms that should always be in constant redefinition, because there's always going to be a group of people that are, for better or worse, unless we're like in this utopian lifestyle, there's always going to be a degree of oppression that's kind of part of the human story. And the people that are the receiving end of that oppression will change from time to time, as we know by now. So I think that those terms should always be contested and redefining themselves. And for example, the term Hispanic, a lot of people did not feel that the term Hispanic also included Black Hispanics, Indigenous Hispanics, people that don't speak Spanish. So it is good that there was a fight to, provide visibility for people of Latin origin and Latinos, right? But it is also good that others are challenging and saying, no, we need to redefine this. And of course, the most obvious aspect of the term Latinx is this gender neutrality that is very important for a lot of people that are part of our community. So, and I think that's why at times some people of Latin origin may push away from Latinx, because they might feel like, well, I have a traditional sense of gender, so I don't need to be incorporated into that group, or I don't want because the Spanish language is a gender language, so I don't want the quote-unquote polluting of language into the Spanish, which to me, it's a little bit, language to me is in constant evolution. Because it's a vehicle, it's a tool that we use to communicate. So, like, of course, language is going to change. So that would be my pushback to that type of ideas, because language should change the same way that identity changes, and these terms should be always contested.
Is there an art movement that you've favored?
I like a lot of art movements. Like I really like Kandinsky and all that. But I have to say that I think that surrealism, it's something that continues to inspire me, and it's something that when I mentioned earlier that my parents had like a print, a reproduction of that Salvador Dali's portrait of Abraham Lincoln in our house. Now as an adult, I'm like, oh wow, I grew up looking at an image that had Abraham Lincoln as well, this other portrait of Gala, his wife, in there. And that play of reality and imagination was always a constant. And I think that that has helped me as a woman, a Black Latina navigating into this world, that sense of creativity and that idea that I can always change my reality through imagination and creativity has been very inspirational and useful for my career. So I definitely, I have to give it up to the surreal.
What do you enjoy most about your curatorial role?
Thinking about culture and art and kind of working with artists as well and working with people. Like for me, I really enjoy when we can develop a project in which, donors, patrons, artists, audiences, we all meet together to work for a common goal. I think that moment of flow, I will describe it, that we're just kind of in this process, in this moment together, creating something I really, really enjoy. Delving into history as well, like, and looking how my experiences have echoed in the past with others, that gives me a sense of community and kind of overall communion with a larger kind of human history that to me is also very rewarding. And I enjoy the practice. Like I enjoy the intellectual engagement. That to me is very important. Kind of like the exercise on the brain that art helps you and facilitates. Like art facilitates conversations, hard conversations, easy conversations, and in conversations that allows us to understand ourselves better.
What do you feel is the purpose of art?
Community. And I think it's a combination of community with self-reflection and kind of this internal process. Like, for example, I'm not an art maker, but I'm really into like exercise and longevity in the brain. So lately I've been trying to color with my non-dominant hand. And that is so soothing to the brain. So there's this practice about art that even if you're not an artist, I'm not an artist, that when you do it, it kind of helps to release and to kind of provide a sense of equilibrium in your body. And then at the same time, so that's on a personal level, but then on a group level, it allows to this kind of group validation and this group conversation and this community aspect that is so important for us as humans, as social beings and kind of community-oriented beings. So it has to me that those different facets of the spiritual practice of art at the personal level, but also at the group level. So it's kind of like this innate. I think that's why children kind of gravitate to that, like, because it's kind of those innate practices or educational vehicles or that we as human can do in contrast to other animals and beings that are in the earth, right?
How do you feel the Black Lives Matter movement impacted the mission of art institutions?
I think that's a tricky question that I don't have all the answers to. But I can tell you that today, my reflection on that is the following. Certainly, the Black Lives Matter movement had an impact in some institutions, not all. And the impact that it had in some was that it pushed them to review their collections better, to kind of think about more about equity, and to try to also not only equity in terms of collections and staff, but also board members. But I preface that saying that there's always been movements like this throughout, like museums, especially in the 20th century. Like the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, we all had more, the 90s. There were certainly moments of kind of this conversation about inclusivity that had different languages or different terminology. So in that sense, that's not something new, right? So I think that it is important, as we know that we have these types of conversation in institutions every so often, to be cognizant of that and to really look at the things that are really gonna make equitable change. And by that, I can provide an example. So in the 70s and 80s, these conversations were, especially in the 70s, were very prevalent. And a lot of shows that had, like, Black artists, brown artists, like people of color, right, would start being generated in museums. But that did not translate into art collecting. So those works were not being acquired by the institutions. And that's something to look at, because ultimately the collection is what remains. So how can we then, knowing now with the knowledge that we have about how equity and inclusion always comes into the conversation every so often, how can we then start making transformative, equitable actions, like looking at the collection, making acquisitions, also looking at our exhibition calendar and not doing like that just one show every 10 years or so. Like I said, in some, it made some type of impact, in others, not so much. But overall, the movement does speak at a macro level at the cycles of inclusivity that cultural institutions have. And we should be critical and look at how can we then use these types of conversations to really make equitable change.
What do you feel is the role of the trustee, the art patron, or even the collector?
I think that, like artists, like me as a curator, and like museum directors, the patron, trustee, collector, we all share, and we should be sharing, a desire for curiosity, and really always remain curious and about art, independently of where it's coming from. I think that that's important, and that's something that we should all be sharing in common. And also, I would say that we are all supporters of art, right? I think that collectors, again, should remain curious about artists, about new art practices, supporting artists and supporting institutions, and trustees as well. I do think that trustees have a different degree of influence, in the sense that they can find other like-minded individuals that will then support organizations or support exhibitions. So I think it'll be great. It's great when trustees can rally the troops and engage individuals that can become other supporters of the museum at their level. So for me, trustees are kind of like this big cheerleader that also has influence and can hopefully, we're all in conversation to support our own curiosities. But I also think that it also depends on the organization. Like some museums, fundraising is a big, big deal. So certainly they should be wearing their fundraising hat. And others, you couple that also with their connections to the city. So for example, at my previous museum, it had a lot of connections with the city government. So how can, you have to also be in the politics of things, of the community. So there's like a lot of, I think that knowing also as a board member, knowing what's the fabric of the ecosystem of the city and of your organization is very important, to then know how you can be a better board member, because every institution is different. And I also think that board members can be advocates for better process internally. And I say that lightly because ultimately the director and the museum staff, they should trust the director, they should trust the staff, but they might have knowledge that we don't have. So for example, there could be a board member that has a lot of knowledge on art law, and a museum may not have a counsel inside its premises. So there's a way that the board member can support providing a knowledge, expertise in that realm to kind of better the museum and better the organization. But a board member, I would say that aside from being curious, they should remain engaged and know that that engagement and that curiosity is leveled by or balanced by the need of the organization.
So share with us, what are you excited about right now?
I'm excited about the upcoming triennial called Flow States, which I'm co-curating with Susana Temkins and Rodrigo Maura from El Museo del Barrio. It is a nationwide Latinx triennial that includes artists based in the US, but also from other parts of the world. And we're really thinking about how the Latinx construction is really a coalition of solidarities that engages Black, Indigenous, European descent, and so on artists that share these histories of colonization with the Spanish crown, but also with the US. And we are also including artists from the Philippines, which people might be like, what? But, the Philippines was part of the Spanish crown. It also has connection to the US in terms of politics and so on. And also, when you look at the food in the Philippines or the names of the Philippines, a lot of people think that certain artists are Latino, but they're actually Filipino. So, there's like that kind of connections that cultural and historical that inform those experiences that we're kind of interested in exploring in this exhibition. I'm also researching a lot on Wilfredo Lam, which is somebody that I've researched because I just closed a project here at the museum called Surrealism and Us that looked at the history of surrealism in the Caribbean and with collections of Afro-Surreal. And on a personal level, that's something that is really exciting because I don't know. It's been interesting to read more closely on his life and how, he was a Black Chinese Cuban artist who left to study in Europe and then return to the Caribbean during the Second World War because at the time he was in Paris, the Nazis defeated the French forces, so they all had to escape, which I cannot imagine that experience of having to, because I migrated to the US for a better life, but I didn't feel like I was going to die or I was going to be killed, the way that all these refugees, I guess, were escaping Europe. So, and literally I was just reading about this yesterday, like the tension or the fears that he felt coming back to the Caribbean, because the Caribbean is again, it's beautiful and it's lovely, and I recommend everybody to buy a ticket to go to Puerto Rico and other parts of the Caribbean. But when you grow up there and when you're not part of like the dominant class, when you're different, you're constantly being fed this idea that we're all the same. Like for example, in Puerto Rico, we're like European, Black, and in Taino. But that's not true. And you get your experience as a Black person there, and in his case, Black and Chinese, is very different than the typical kind of white looking, Latin person living in those environments. So there was a sense of fear coming back for him of like that dynamic. And that was for me kind of interested at a personal level. So that excites me as a personal reflection because I felt, I guess, parallelism with my own life as somebody that had to leave the Caribbean and then working within it now and my own kind of reflections of that experience. So those are things that are exciting me right now on a personal and more practical level.
It's wonderful when you love the work you do, right?
Yes. But you always have to remind yourself, and we always have moments of doubt, right? Nothing is perfect. That's okay. And I think that once you kind of realize once you hone in on coping mechanisms that you need, not just because you need them, like you need them at a basic level. That's why we sleep, And that comes with experience, like how to negotiate certain things. It just becomes easier to manage.
I've really enjoyed our conversation. I've learned quite a bit, and I think the work you're doing is wonderful. This is our last question, and you've touched on what I'm about to ask you, but you can summarize it for us. And basically, the question is, how do you want to impact the art world?
I just want to share my point of view, which I think is a point of view that is not often spoken about, but that is part of the majority. I remember and I still this day, every time I'm in a city, especially a US city, I always feel like I'm the majority because I'm Black and Latina. So that's like the kind of the two main groups in most US cities. So I just like to share my experience, and I want to share them for conversation. Like, I'm not trying to say that my story is more important than another, or that I don't want to listen to a different story. I just want to be part of a conversation. So that will be the impact that I strive for, to be able to talk about things and be in communion. So at the most basic level, that's the impact that I want to have. And I think that nowadays, it's really hard at times to listen to a different point of view without judgment and with curiosity. So like for me, when I do a show, and I hear this often with my exhibitions, I often hear, oh, it was so beautiful, even though there were works in them that were, that had hard topics. And to me, that is exactly what I thrive for. I thrive to engage people wherever they're at, and to just share different stories that they didn't know about. Because some of the stories that I'm sharing, like when I started researching, for example, how, Susan Césaire and the Surrealist moment in the Caribbean, all that history, I didn't know about that either. But then when I started researching, oh wow, and this is something that relates so much to who I am. So I just want to share and create those spaces. And to me, when I can do that, that's when I know that's when I feel satisfied. And that's when I feel like, okay, I accomplished something that I wasn't sure, because I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure people are going to be receptive 110%, So yeah, I just want to talk, I guess.
Well, thank you so much. I really look forward to learning more about your nationwide Latinx Biennial.
Thank you. And it's been a pleasure to be here. It's going to open on October 9th in New York City. So if you're in New York, from October, and I think it closes like January, February, I believe. So stop by, see the show, and let me know. You can find me on Instagram and let me know what you think.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for listening to Cerebral Women Art Talks podcast. For additional content, please visit cerebralwomen.com and be sure to follow Cerebral Women on Instagram.